In 2025, three very different true crime cases dominated headlines across continents, yet each exposed the same unsettling truth. The most devastating harm often comes from the places we feel safest. These are not stories of strangers in the dark, but of trust, proximity, and betrayal. This is True Crime in 2025. Case 1. The Erin Patterson mushroom deaths. In July 2023, a small town in regional Victoria, Australia became the center of an investigation that would later grip the nation. Erin Patterson, a resident of Leongatha, hosted a family lunch at her home. The meal was beef Wellington, a classic dish often reserved for special occasions. Among the guests were her former in-laws, Dawn Patterson Gale's sister, Heather Wilkinson, Heather's husband, Ian Wilkinson. Within hours of the lunch, all four guests became violently ill. 3 later died from organ failure. Ian Wilkinson survived after weeks in intensive care. Medical testing confirmed exposure to death cap mushrooms, scientifically known as Amanita phalloides, one of the most toxic mushrooms on Earth. Even small amounts can destroy the liver and kidneys. What initially appeared to be a tragic food poisoning incident quickly became something far more sinister. Investigators focused on how the mushrooms entered the meal. Death caps are not commonly sold in supermarkets and require either foraging knowledge or deliberate sourcing. Police alleged inconsistencies in Patterson's statements and behavior following the lunch.
And regarding a patient that presented here earlier but has left the building and is potentially exposed to a fatal toxin from mushroom poisoning.
It's a tragedy what's happened.
In November 2023, Erin Patterson was formally charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder. By 2025, her trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria had become one of the most closely followed legal proceedings in Australian history. Daily live updates, courtroom sketches, and expert testimony dominated news cycles. Prosecutors argued the poisoning was deliberate. The defense maintained it was a tragic accident, denying any intent to harm. At the time of reporting, the case remained a defining example of how circumstantial evidence, forensic toxicology, and motive are weighed in modern murder trials. The Erin Patterson case reminds us that murder does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as hospitality.
Patterson has been convicted. After more than 2 months, the blockbuster mushroom trial has finally come to an end.
The Kendra Licari cyberbullying case. The final story takes us to Michigan, where a crime unfolded not in person, but through a screen. Kendra Licari was a mother, a basketball coach, and a trusted community member in Beale City. Beginning in 2020, her teenage daughter, Lauren Licari, and Lauren's boyfriend, Owen McKenney, began receiving anonymous text messages. At first, they were confusing, then relentless. The messages escalated to dozens per day. They included insults, sexual harassment, threats, messages encouraging self-harm. Law enforcement initially suspected peers. Friendships fractured. Students were interrogated. The psychological toll mounted. In 2022, federal investigators traced the digital footprint of the messages to an IP address associated with the Licari home. The sender was not a stranger. It was Lauren's mother. Kendra Licari was arrested and later pleaded guilty in 2023 to 2 counts of stalking a minor. She was sentenced to 19 months to 5 years in prison. She was released on parole in August 2024 under strict conditions, including no contact with her daughter. The case reached a wider audience in 2025 through the Netflix documentary Unknown Number, The High School Catfish, which examined the emotional damage inflicted on the victims and raised broader questions about control, manipulation, and digital abuse within families. This case shattered the assumption that danger online comes from outsiders. Sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. The Kendra Licari case shows us how harm can be inflicted invisibly through anonymous messages, hidden identities, and digital deception. It is a crime defined by concealment, where the truth remained buried behind technology designed to obscure its source. But not all hidden crimes stay buried forever. Sometimes justice does not arrive through confession or exposure, but through patience, through evidence preserved long enough for science to catch up. Our final case is not about deception unfolding in real time, but about a crime that waited decades to be understood. A single footprint, a silent apartment, and forensic evidence that refused to be erased. Our final case takes us back more than 3 decades to a crime that haunted Minnesota for years, until modern forensic science finally spoke for a victim who could no longer speak for herself. On June 13, 1993, 35-year-old Jeannie Ann Childs was found brutally murdered in her Minneapolis apartment. She had been stabbed more than 60 times. There were no witnesses, no clear suspect, and for years, no arrest. What investigators did have was something unusual, a bloody footprint left at the crime scene. At the time, forensic technology was limited. DNA testing existed, but databases were small and processing was slow. The footprint, while carefully documented, could not immediately be tied to a suspect. The case went cold, but it was never forgotten. For decades, Minneapolis police preserved evidence from the scene, including biological material and the footprint impression left in blood. As DNA technology advanced, the case was periodically revisited. The breakthrough came years later, when improved DNA profiling techniques allowed investigators to re-examine preserved evidence. In 2022, DNA from the crime scene was matched to Jerry Westrom, a man with a violent criminal history who had been previously investigated but never charged. What made the case especially compelling was the convergence of 2 forensic disciplines. First, DNA evidence linked Westrom to the crime scene. Then, forensic analysts revisited the bloody footprint. Experts testified that the footprint's size, shape, and wear pattern were consistent with footwear connected to Westrom, strengthening the prosecution's case. In 2023, nearly 30 years after Jeannie Childs was killed, Jerry Westrom was convicted of her murder. In 2025, CBS Minnesota's WCCO released Footprint to Murder, a WCCO original, a documentary that meticulously retraces the investigation. The film examines how patient evidence preservation, evolving forensic science, and persistence by investigators ultimately delivered justice. Rather than relying on sensationalism, the documentary focuses on the science, how footprints can tell a story, how DNA can outlast time, and how cold cases are sometimes only waiting for technology to catch up. The murder of Jeannie Ann Childs reminds us that time does not erase evidence, it only delays its voice. And in this case, forensic science finally allowed that voice to be heard. These cases, spanning continents and decades, reveal the evolving face of true crime. Together, they remind us that crime is not always loud. It is often quiet, ordinary, hidden in meals, messages, moments, and memories. But they also remind us of something else, that truth has a way of resurfacing, through persistence, through evidence, through science, and through the voices of those who refuse to let victims be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you value carefully researched, responsible true crime storytelling, consider subscribing. And remember, sometimes justice is immediate, and sometimes it takes decades to leave its mark.